Hey guys, Tyler Ansman here with Tyler Ansman Performance. So today we're going to do a Q&A session. So in the future, if you have questions you'd like to submit, you can leave them kind of in the comments below this video, or feel free to kind of email us with that as well. But we're just going to get into it. All right, so first one coming with some heat. At what age do you think individualizing your sport of choice and training more heavily towards it is best? Okay, so I think this question gets a lot of time for a lot of people. And I think there's a couple of ways to address this, and it involves some nuance, which people don't tend to do well with, but we're gonna try to get there. So I think there's a couple of things here. So the first is that I think everybody is trying to get people away from one sport year round, which I think as a whole is a positive thing. You should not be actively competing in your sport year round, especially as an amateur. Like then there's no training and development time if nothing else, let alone the health aspects of that. So I think that's a positive thing as far as that goes. The second piece is when you're young, you do want to build this kind of movement quality base with a bunch of variety, all of these different inputs, all of this kind of stuff. And if you look at, some of the more productive long-term athletic development models, we have these different kind of stages, kids go through, where they get exposed to gymnastics and other things like that, where they can kind of build their base of movement quality. I think that's really good. And so what I would say is with younger kids, especially if they like multiple sports, by all means, have them play multiple sports. I think it's great. I think when we start kind of getting into when should people specialize, I think high school, sophomore year of high school, that's kind of the range that I would typically look at, where like if you want to take this thing as far as you possibly can, we should start specializing. Now, so there's a couple of things here. So if you tell me, hey, I really want to be great at baseball, but I don't feel like I can live without basketball, for example, that's fine. Then you should play basketball. Like the quality of life piece is an important part of this as well. However, understand there's a trade-off, as there is with everything. If you're going to play basketball, it is going to take away a little bit from your baseball development. And if you're fine with that, cool, we're all on the same page. I think the thing that people miss for the most part is they're like, oh man, all of these guys who were first-round picks from the Northeast, they played multiple sports in high school. It's like, yeah, these guys were going to be great regardless. They threw 95 when they were 16 years old. Like they were great at multiple sports because they were naturally gifted athletes who would have been great at whatever they did. They're not great at baseball because they also played basketball or ran track or whatever it was, right? When you're very young, again, I think it's a positive thing, although if younger kids don't like multiple sports, I think we can give them the inputs that we need through training if they don't want to go play soccer, for example. We just need to make sure they're not playing baseball all year and pitching 12 months of the year. That's kind of the main thing that I think we're after here, right? So when we look at examples of guys being great at multiple sports, and they're Julius Peppers and people like this, they were going to be great at whatever they chose regardless. They just happened to choose basketball and football. Had they just chosen football, probably would have been just as good at football, all right? So I think there's some nuance there that's important. So when we get to high school, when we get to sophomore year, I think it's probably time to start talking about specializing, because if you're a regular person, you're competing against freaks like that. So you're going to have to put in more training time, development time, all of these things. Your effort is going to have to be more focused than theirs is. All right. So I think that's that. We can get into this more later if people have additional questions, but that's kind of where I would go with the sport specialization piece. Okay. What's the biggest misconception behind training velocity? I don't know if there's one. I think there's a bunch. I think a couple of big ones that I would go to, kind of the first one is, if we're training for velocity, we're no longer training to be a good pitcher. And I think that's completely misguided. All right. I think people think if we're training for velocity, automatically command is going to, kind of go down the tube. We're going to get worse, all of these things. What we know when we look at the data is that as pitch velocity increases, right, especially on fastballs, and pretty much every pitch outside of the changeup doesn't seem to have as strong of a correlation, but pretty much every pitch, especially the fastball, as the velocity goes up, success by hitters goes down by pretty much whichever metric you measure it by, whether it's batting average, how hard the ball was hit and put in play, all of these things. They all tend to decrease as fastball velocity increases, okay? So velocity development is pitching development. This is something I've talked about before. So I think that's probably the biggest misconception, but I think there's a few. I think people tend to think that, for whatever reason, that somehow training mechanics and training velocity are two separate things, right? the efficiency of your movement does tend to a large degree, like that your technical efficiency tends to drive your output. I mean, if we think about this with swimming and sprinting and everything, it makes perfect sense, but for some reason that's lost in pitching or throwing or whatever for a lot of the reason I don't really understand that. They're not two separate things. When we're training the mechanics to be more efficient, we are also training for throwing velocity and vice versa. Right? The way we do that may be a little bit different. It's not going to be old school, sit on a bucket, toss you a ball, tell you what you did wrong. We're going to use a constraints-led approach, which we can dive into more at a different time. But I think those are probably the two, very biggest misconceptions. And then a close third would be that training for velocity means you're going to get hurt. What we do see is that as throwing velocity increases, risk of injury does also tend to increase, just because we see these the torques and stress and all of these things kind of go up at the relevant joints and things as we see throwing velocity increase. However, the counterpoint to that is kind of, if we're trying to take whatever sport to the highest possible level we can, there's always risk. We're kind of walking a razor's edge, right? If you're Usain Bolt and you're running at kind of the fastest ever 100-meter times, how many times per year do you think he truly went full out sprinting? It was only a handful, right? Because to recover from that was super, super taxing, right? And when I say that, we're talking about over kind of the full 100-meter distance. But again, so as we get to these really, really high performance levels, whether it's sprinting, jumping, throwing, whatever it is, we're gonna have more risk than we would if we were just like, hey, we're gonna throw 70 miles an hour and throw strikes forever. That's fine, but you're closing doors for yourself in terms of what level you're gonna actually be able to participate in this sport at. And that's fine if you're okay with that, but that's kind of where we're at there. So those I think, you got 3 for the price of 1 there in terms of biggest misconceptions. Okay, what is the easiest part and what is the hardest part about training baseball players? Okay, I think the hardest part in a lot of cases is getting that competition window shortened a bit, right? So many guys want to play in the spring, they want to play in the summer, they want to play in the fall, which, let's be honest, that stretches into the winter at this point, and they want to do showcases in the winter as well. And so finding these really significant development windows is probably the hardest part, just making everybody understand that, like, generally speaking, exposure is not the limitation, right? Social media exists, all these. Coaches will see you, right? If you throw in front of the Vanderbilt coaching staff 150 times, you throw 75 miles an hour, guess what? You're not getting signed. If they hear about you throwing 100, though, they're probably going to send someone to find you. And guess what? If you can do that and put that on social media, that's your ticket, right? You're going to have plenty of opportunities. So I think that's kind of the thing is just kind of getting the time for actual development is probably one of the most difficult parts. In terms of what's the easiest part, I mean, I think getting guys ready for high days is pretty easy. Everybody likes kind of that push day, the competition, the environment's really fun. I think that's probably the easiest part. It's just those high days are really, really fun. Everybody has a good time. So I think those are probably those. Okay. At what points have you had to learn to block out some of the professional advice and instead started to kind of repave with your own thoughts and philosophies in terms of throwing? All right. So I think when you're really young and you're learning, the goal is kind of to find people, the goal is always to find people smarter than yourself and learn from them. But especially when you're young, you're a line cook, right? You're taking orders from the chef. You're putting that recipe together based on their instructions. As you grow, right, I think most people want to become the chef. You want to build your own recipes and kind of have those put into action. And so I think as you go through this, as you're learning, you always want to be kind of putting this into, your own context, seeing it through your own lens, those kinds of things, drawing your own conclusions as you get more information. And I think looking outside of your sport and your population tends to be really helpful. All right, so for me, right, I'm dealing with primarily baseball players and more specifically primarily pitchers, but I like looking into track and field and soccer and some of these other places where they have interesting technical and periodization models and all these things, and they have different focuses for their training. But all of the physiological aspects and those kinds of things are super interesting to dig into. So I think, when did I start doing that? Probably pretty early on. I knew from the jump that I kind of wanted to be able to kind of run my own thing and kind of change the way things were done. I wasn't happy with the status quo. But I think really early on, it's important to kind of learn, listen, all of these things before you go trying to put your own spin on things. You want to see how they're done, see how they work first, think about what you would do differently, what you could make better, and then we go that route. All right, so I think that's the really important piece there. With, kind of digging in, kind of putting your own spin on things, having your own philosophies, that kind of thing. All right, next one. If you're trying to put on weight, would you focus on eating more healthy food or just more food in general? Okay, so again, some nuance with this question. So when we're talking about gaining weight, it's a math problem. We need to be in a caloric surplus to increase our body weight. So what you're eating, whether you're trying to gain or lose weight, right, math problem, it doesn't necessarily matter what you eat, it matters how much for just the number on the scale. All right, there was a professor years ago who did an experiment where he lost X amount of pounds only drinking beer and eating donuts just to make a point. And so, right, you can eat whatever you want to gain or lose weight. The amount is the important thing. Now, beyond that, though, there are health outcomes that come from hitting our macro and micronutrient numbers on a day-to-day basis, right? So there's things we want to consider with that. But I think the way I generally look at eating is it's more important that we're getting all of the things we need than limiting some of the extra things, right? If we're hitting our kind of minimum numbers on, protein, carbs, fat, we're hitting all of our kind of vitamins, minerals, all of those things. Having a donut or a cookie or all of these things is not a big deal. Like, have other stuff. Just make sure we're getting, our fibrous vegetables, right? Those are things that a lot of guys miss. Make sure we're hitting our protein numbers. Make sure we're doing all of these things. What a lot of the research says in terms of negative health outcomes from specific types of diets, like in terms of red meat. One of the issues with a lot of these studies is that they're asking people what they ate years ago. So that's one thing. But the second thing is, typically, if we're seeing somebody eating red meat 7 days a week, for example, they are probably not also exercising enough or eating enough leafy green vegetables. And so there was a study where they drew kind of an association between red meat consumption and high levels of red meat consumption and your risk for colorectal cancer. But what they didn't account for were those exercise and other kind of health indicators, and then their intake of fibrous vegetables and things like that. And I think those things probably limit your risk to some degree. Again, this isn't medical advice. This is just kind of where my head goes with these things. But so in general, you want to make sure you're checking all of your health boxes, right? Because if you're not healthy, you're not going to be able to perform well, right? That's just kind of a bare minimum thing. So we want to make sure we're at least hitting our baselines for all of these things, getting what we need. But on top of that, is there room for like some quote unquote junk food in your diet? Absolutely. It's just not a big deal. So I would focus on making sure that it's mostly healthy, right? 80 to 90%, like good foods, right? Checking those boxes that we talked about. But beyond that, eat what you want. Make sure we're hitting the calorie numbers that you need to hit. All right. Starters versus relievers. How do you manage their cycles differently? Okay, so I think this, again, some nuance here. So when we're talking about starters versus relievers, obviously there's a couple of main differences. One is the frequency of their usage during the season. Two is the volume within a game. And three tends to be the intensity of every single throw. And so I think as we get into the season and close to the season, the preparation differs more. In our early off season, how different are starters and relievers? Not very, right? We're going to individualize certain things based on the guy in front of us, but in terms of them being a starter versus a reliever, how much of a difference does that make? Not much at all. As we get closer to the season, what does it look like? It looks like they're going to have their high intensity days a little bit more frequently, right? They're going to have lower doses of these things. And then within the season, their model is put together a bit differently in terms of what the microcycle looks like and how flexible that has to be, right? If you're a starter at the college level, you're throwing once every 7 days. If you're at the professional level, generally you're once every 5 days. So you have this kind of set schedule for the most part, especially if you're one of the three main guys. If you are a reliever, it's much more up in the air than that. So for a starter, if we know you're the Friday guy, we can very easily build your microcycle and it doesn't change much, save for rain delays and things like that. For relievers, it has to be much more flexible. It has to be if this, then this, right? And they're going to have to be more willing to, in some cases, get a lift in after a game. Things along those lines. So that's how that stuff differs, especially in season. Again, leading up to the season, how that kind of frequency of touching that intensity works. Certainly the volume of their kind of pens and high intensity days will differ a little bit, but early in the off season, not very different. All right, people always talk about easy velo. How do you train that? Okay, so I think a couple of things here. So first is when we're seeing guys throw hard and it looks, effortless, what we're seeing is mechanical efficiency, right? So that's kind of the big thing. These guys are generally pretty good movers. The second piece to that is that we may have other guys who throw really hard and look super high effort. And so there's something that I've touched on before is these guys who are really kind of nervous system driven versus the guys who are more like efficiency driven and what that looks like. So the nervous system guys are going to tend to have these bigger swings in their velocity because like when everything's right and it's all clicking, from like a nervous system perspective, from an arousal perspective, they're going to throw really hard. And then on other days they might have these big dips because they're not necessarily as efficient of movers. Whereas the more efficient guys, the easy velo guys, are going to tend to have more steady velocity from outing to outing. How do you train this? Well, when we do a mechanical analysis, we're going to look at, what are the limiting factors for a given guy and what do they do really well. We want to make sure we keep the superpowers and kind of, bring their weaknesses up to a level where it's not limiting them as much anymore. And so I think it kind of depends on the guy exactly how you train this. But I think some of the general methods that we like to use for things like this would be the velo horseshoes, right, where you have a specific range you're going to be in. It's a sub-maximal range, but pretty close to full intensity. And there's points, it's competitive, all that kind of stuff, but you're trying to throw in this range as easily as possible, call out the number ahead of time, so you can get a feel for what effort it takes to get there. And we may try to throw that hard at a lower effort from throw to throw, all of that can be done. The other option would be like a +1 type bullpen that's popularized by Dave Coggin. And so what that would look like is essentially you start at a pretty easy number to hit, let's say 80% effort, and then you just go 1 mile per hour per throw until you can no longer do that at whatever the RPE may be for the day. Maybe it's a 10, maybe it's a 9, maybe it's 9.5, whatever. Those would be kind of the general methods we might use to kind of train that. And then, on the kind of the weight room side, what you're seeing is kind of how well that connective tissue works. And so training some of that elasticity would be the next thing. So plyometrics, so both extensive and intensive through a variety of ranges of motion, oscillatory training the eccentric and isometric processes. All of this would be kind of the big thing. And we'll dig more into that stuff in a different video, but that would be kind of where my head goes for a lot of that. But yeah, easy velo, that would be kind of the way. All right, okay. Favorite pitcher ever and favorite pitcher today. Okay, favorite pitcher ever, probably Nolan Ryan. That was my guy. I watched that video with him, Tom House, and Randy Johnson a million times when I was in elementary school, when I was, trying to train myself. And shout out, though, to Kerry Wood. I was a Cubs fan for a while Kerry Wood and Mark Pryor pitched for the Cubs. Kerry Wood was that dude. That was a fun guy to watch. So shout out to him. There's actually a poster in the back here of Kerry Wood. So shout out to him as like an honorable mention favorite pitcher ever. Favorite pitcher today, it's probably DeGrom. Just fun to watch. Like when he's on the field, there's not like a more fun guy to watch than that. I've liked Verlander for a long time too, both of those guys. But yeah, those are probably my 4 main guys from ever and today. Okay, favorite stadium. Well, being a Baltimore guy, it's got to be Camden Yards. The ones that I'm being told that I need to go see are Pittsburgh and San Francisco. But I've been to some other cool ones, but Camden Yards is pretty great. It's a fun time going to a game there, super nice stadium, and was kind of the blueprint for some of the other ones, especially in Denver. So probably Camden Yards. Who will win the World Series? I think probably whoever comes out of the Dodgers-Phillies series. By the time this goes up, this series is probably over. But at this point, it's not done yet. But probably whoever comes out of that series. I wouldn't mind seeing the Mariners win, though. We've got a bunch of guys in here who are Mariners fans for whatever reason, which is kind of funny. But also, I remember when the Mariners had Randy Johnson and A-Rod and Ken Griffey Jr. and all those guys, and it was a fun team. Seattle's a cool city. So I wouldn't hate seeing the Mariners win. Obviously, I did a video on Brian Wu as well. I think they've got a pretty good staff. They got a good team. Obviously, the home runs coming out of there are fun too. So yeah, that would, I think probably the Phillies or Dodgers, but would like to see the Mariners. All right, I think that's where we'll leave it today for the Q&A. But like I said, if you got questions for the next one, we'll do this every so often. So feel free to drop them in the comments below or shoot us an email. If you got questions about remote or in-person training, also feel free to shoot us an email. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.